Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next session of this conference. This is the Identity, the Individual, and Inclusion panel. And if I could ask my panelists to please go ahead and unmute themselves so we can start this conversation. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Eva Velasquez, President and CEO of the Identity Theft Resource Center. And joining me today are our panelists, Burdell Lewis, Senior Vice President, Centralized Shared Services for Synchrony Financial, Chris Peterson, the founder of Penny Forward, and Reverend Ben Roberts, the Associate Pastor and Director of Social Justice for the Foundry United Methodist Church. Now, before we jump into the questions for our panel, I just want to lay a foundation for this conversation we're going to have today. You know, much of what we do in the identity, privacy, and security space, it's designed to bring order to the chaos. And the goal of this panel is to help us look at how we achieve some greater identity protection without overlooking the fact that not everyone is the same. The way we use, maintain, and protect our identities, it varies among different individuals for a variety of reasons. Some of those can be cultural or they can be accessibility reasons. And whether you call them citizens, consumers, or end users, whether your job is to shape policy or design actual software, these are the people that are impacted by the decisions that we make at all levels. And we need to look at all facets of this issue if we want to provide solutions that work for everyone. This is really important for government agencies. They can't choose their customers, but there are a lot of learnings here for businesses as well. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the privacy by design, security by default. I think most of us have heard that and hopefully adopted that. This is that concept that ensures that privacy is at the beginning of the planning stages and not something that's an afterthought that we address later. Can we apply similar principles to address the exclusion and the barriers that our policies and practices and systems in this space create for some individuals? Can we adopt a diversity by design, inclusion by default mindset? And that'll help us start to build culturally competent practices and service delivery. I mean, this feels like a necessary next step in our fight, and hopefully you agree. The reason this came about back in 2018, thanks in part to a grant by the Department of Justice Office of Victims of Crime, the ITRC began engaging various communities to do this type of exploration and do this type of work. And for me personally, it's been a very educational and rewarding experience. You know, over the last couple of years, admittedly, we've done a lot more listening than talking. And I learned things that I simply didn't consider and didn't understand because I've never had the direct life experience. One of the examples I can give is I was talking with a representative from Deaf Community Services, one of our partner organizations, and we were discussing how we could modify, change the delivery of our information so that it would be the most meaningful to this community. And she told me to consider that most members of her community learn to speak ASL, American Sign Language, as their first language, with English being their second language. And organizationally, we have many materials and we've received training on how to help folks who are non-native English speakers in this really complicated space. I simply didn't realize that we needed to take some of those learnings and apply them to our service delivery for the deaf, hard of hearing community. It was really an aha moment for me. And that's what I'm hoping this panel creates today for everyone listening, an opportunity to understand the identity issue from a different perspective. So enough from me. Let's hear from our panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and we'll go down the line. Let's go ahead and start with you, Chris. Chris Peterson, you're the founder of Penny Forward. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, about the mission of Penny Forward, how it came to be, and even some of your other professional experience, because I know it aligns with Penny Forward's mission.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. I'm Chris Peterson. I'm the founder and president of CEO of Penny Forward. Its mission is to provide financial literacy education to people who are blind. I'm totally blind myself. And it's no secret anymore that there is a financial literacy epidemic in this country, and blind people need to be included in the solution to that. And that's why I started Penny Forward. I'm also just incredibly pleased to be here because most of my career, I've been working as a software developer and software architect, and it just happens that I worked in cybersecurity for much of that time. So I have been involved in design of authentication systems and authorization systems, and a lot of the things that we're talking about here today, from that side of it too. And so I see both sides of the struggle. And I'm really pleased to be here to be able to talk about my experiences with that.
Thanks so much, Chris. I am looking forward to your insights. I think they're going to be great. Let's move over to Burdell. Burdell Lewis, I already listed your title, and I'd like you to explain that a little bit more. But I just want to say, Burdell and I have been working on a project, Synchrony and the ITRC, to better understand how identity crimes impact the Black community. Can you share more about your work involving identity and inclusion and why it's important to you? And I'm really glad to have you here because we've really enjoyed this exploratory project that we're working on together.
Outstanding, Eva, and thank you for the very nice welcome and warm wishes. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion. A big shout out and hello to my co-panel members as well. My name is Burdell Lewis. I am Senior Vice President of Centralized Shared Service at Synchrony. The role itself entails leading a couple organizations that have north of 600 different employees. They're enabling functions that really look at our digital strategy for our cardholders that we have in queue. More importantly, with regards to our discussion today, our interaction, quite honestly, is the byproduct of the $50 million investment that Synchrony and our foundation is making in diverse communities. This is where we're really looking to empower students, communities, as well as our employees in a number of different facets. We want to create pathways to college completion. We're looking to build skills for the future, or assist with building skills for the future, as well as closing the overall financial knowledge gap. I think it's no secret that we all know, particularly from a fraud perspective, we're seeing an influx of different drivers from when looking at credit tools, when looking at auto sales, when looking at banking, lending, and debt collection. All of those are near and dear, but the thing that really strikes me closely, and I learned this by working with some of the collegiate institutions that we have relationships with, particularly on the HBCU side, historically Black universities, is what is taking place with our college students. And I'll try to be brief and very succinct, but ask you and the panel members, but also individuals who are listening to this important discussion. Imagine that you're a Black student and you received a great scholarship, whether it be academic or athletic. You get to campus, things are going well, you're there your second year, you haven't had to apply for any student loans or financial assistance. Something happens, whether it be to an injury, you want to take additional classes or whatever the case may be, you go to apply for a student loan and you find out that your identity has been stolen, or you have some significant or awkward detrimental things on your credit bureau, and you're the first one from your family to ever attend college. You're away from home, you're on a campus, and what do? Who do you go to? Who do you report this to? So as we have this discussion, I really urge everyone to think about when we have situations of fraud, identity theft, significant dysfunction from a financial economic perspective relative to credit bureaus and credit scoring and things of that nature. What are the steps that one would take? What do those stories look like? And more importantly, what is the outreach programs that we need to put in place or have a line of sight on to help these individuals?
Thanks, Burdell. I couldn't agree with you more. We've had
Thank you.
many of those conversations. And last but certainly not least, Reverend Ben Roberts. I have to admit, I'm a little bit jealous of your title, Associate Pastor who works on social justice issues. It sounds like a superhero title. But can you explain to the folks listening what that work looks like and why it's important to you?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I'm Reverend Ben Roberts. I'm a pastor at a United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. It's called Foundry. I've been here now 9 years in my position. And on my week-to-week work, I'll oversee things, from food service, cooking, distribution of clothing, teaching English classes, all of that stuff. But the thing we do every single week that has me here is something we call our ID ministry. The ID ministry that I work with is there, first of all, from like a theological perspective to honor the Imago Dei in every person. So the image of God in every person, each person's basic humanity. We call it the ID ministry for that reason. But what we do there is we help unhoused or homeless individuals and low-income individuals as they are going through the process of applying for birth certificates, IDs, social security cards, because we want to be able to, one, help them navigate what is becoming a more and more complicated process, but also to free that particular group up in terms of having to pay those fees. We service about 2,000 people a year. It's a little bit under that with the pandemic. We had to be kind of remote for part of that. And we have seen, 95+% of the guests that come to see us are African American, most of them from Washington, D.C., some from Maryland and Northern Virginia. We're talking incomes in between $0 to $30,000 a year in one of the most expensive cities in the country. And so our goal is like, let me just try and take care of this fee that can range from $23 up to around $50. Usually we see it on average right around $44. Let me save you that $44 so you can put that where it really needs to be. And so that's our goal. Walk with you in the process, free you up to really focus on the things that need to get focused on, and just get you off to a good start as you're trying to pursue things for jobs, education, and housing.
Thanks, Pastor Ben. Now, we touched on this a little bit in the introductions, but let's get a little bit more detailed about what some of these experiences for these folks actually look and feel like. You guys are all on the front lines of this issue. You speak with your communities regularly, and you may even have some personal experiences that you're willing to share. So let's start with each of you giving us some examples of the exclusion in this space that you've encountered, and then any suggestions you have on how we can solve some of these problems. How can we make some of these processes more inclusive? And I'll go ahead, I'll start with Burdell. I'll start with you, and then we can go to Chris and Pastor Ben again.
Eva, just a couple things I'll point out as I think through your question. I think it's no secret that Black people, the Black community, is being targeted even more, particularly in during this pandemic, as we try to get on the back end of that with more scams, potential fraud, and things of that nature. I think some of the scenarios that I've encountered, that I've heard about, that I've witnessed students just break down and cry about, is when your own family members steal your identity, whether it be due to the need of getting what I would call local utilities, heat, gas, things of that nature, or if it's more egregious where someone stole your identity, mom, dad, sister, brother, and purchased vehicles, got a credit card, a lot of different things like that. Those are examples of your question, but again, I continue to urge this group and others to think about, when this happens, what is the right thing to do? What is the path and or journey or programs one could take to overcome this challenge? Because once it's already happened, it's done with, but you're left there holding nothing, and you're looking to take steps forward, and you may be educated, you may not. And we see the biggest opportunity with our youth, meaning those who are at the college level, 18 to 24, as well as our elderly. right? So thinking those two populations, the elderly has been through a lot, very knowledgeable, may or may not be trusting. The youth has not been through a heck of a lot, but they may be very knowledgeable and willing to research, but what is it they should do and where is it that they should go?
Right. Well, they may be willing to do the research, but there's so much misinformation out there.
Yes.
How can they discern what are the best practices moving forward? Chris, same question. I know when we talked before, we've definitely talked about barriers and accessibility issues that I don't think everybody thinks about when they think about our standard practices, you know, how you authenticate yourself and things of that nature. I know you have some things you wanted to share there.
I did, and I predict that all of us are going to end up saying kind of the same thing in different ways, because we have to remember that there are African Americans who are blind. And some of those, there's 7 million blind people in the United States, about half of those are seniors. So, you know, when we talk about the problems that are impacting the BIPOC communities or the senior communities, or you know, that intersects with the blind community that I'm involved in. Some of my personal experiences, one of the most recent ones, and it has to do directly with the pandemic. My state ID, and I have to kind of tell you that as I've been listening to all of the sessions today, there's been a lot of talk about driver's licenses. I can't have a driver's license. I don't have a driver's license. I have a state ID, and yet driver's license is almost universally mentioned as an identity requirement when applying for bank accounts. And a state ID serves just as well, but it's not included. And some people are going to read the language and say, well, I don't have a driver's license. This is shutting me out. And they won't even try. It's just the way it is. So we need to stop talking in terms of driver's licenses. And I would really urge people to think long and hard about that. Anyway, most recently, I worked with my treasurer of my board for Penny Forward, and we are in the process of opening a bank account for the organization, which is 3 months old now. And I needed to provide proof of identification for myself, as did he. Both of us are blind, and there were two things that caused us problems. One was we needed to provide pictures of our forms of ID, and while we have those forms of ID available to us and we have smartphones, there are lots of blind people that have smartphones. Trying to line up your smartphone's camera over the top of your ID and get a picture of it that's got all four corners in frame and everything is a very challenging proposition if you don't have help. We are a bit lucky in that we do have help, but not everybody does. And not everybody wants to ask for help for something as private and personal as opening a bank account. The second issue for me personally is that my state ID is expired. I just turned 44 in December and it expired on my birthday. And because of the pandemic, I'm quite hesitant to take public transportation or rideshare services and expose myself and, more importantly, my family to COVID. I have a 2-year-old son who isn't old enough to be vaccinated yet. He actually has COVID right now for the second time. And so I want to minimize his potential to be exposed to COVID so that he can be involved in daycare and programs that he's involved in. And I also want to keep my 10-year-old daughter in school. That's really important. So I'm hesitant to go and renew my ID, which is an in-person process, because of the transportation issues that I have during the pandemic. Fortunately, I had a passport, which would serve just as well, but not everybody with a disability has a passport. Not every American has a passport because not every American has the desire or the means to travel abroad. And for people with disabilities, travel can be sometimes very enjoyable experience and sometimes not one that we desire or that we're able to do. I could go on about this all day. I have many more examples, but I don't want to dominate the panel. So I'll turn it back to you, Eva. And if you want me to talk about more later on, I sure can do that.
I'm sure we'll get into more of those details, but you bring up an interesting point because you're talking about those foundational identity documents, and that's just what Pastor Ben works on. So can you, Pastor Ben, talk about some of the specifics, barriers to access, and some, you've already talked about how the fees can really be a barrier, but I'm sure there are other things that you've encountered when you're helping folks.
So many things, but what I want to focus on is, where I am, just trying to access it at that kind of baseline, birth certificate, Social Security, ID card, just so you can get a job. What we see is that system for kind of verifying your identity is built and basically a white heteronormative way. So it kind of assumes that you are you're probably a guy, if it's going to work for you really well. You're probably a male who's never changed their name. You're probably married, and you have two parents available who can vouch for you. So that's kind of the way the system is set up. And if you've got that going for you, you're going to have a pretty easy time. It doesn't consider in the rules and the checks anybody who has some sort of just a different family structure. I was about to say a broken family system, but it's not necessarily broken. Families don't all look alike, period. That's just how it is. So if you have one parent and you never met the other, then it can quickly backfire on you in the system. So for example, we had a guest who came through, a young lady, she lived with her mom in Maryland. She'd never left the DC, Maryland area in her life. She's 19, 20 years old. She spent her whole life here. But when we went online to try and apply for her birth certificate, all of the knowledge-based assessment questions that came up through the online verification were based on public information related to her father, who she'd never met and who lived in Florida. And so every question that came up in the KVA was questions about, have you ever lived at this address in Orlando? Have you ever had this phone number? All the area codes are from Florida. Which one of these properties are you not associated with? And so for her, she's just sitting there and just getting every single question wrong because it was she just never encountered it, never met her dad. It had never been a discussion. But we build the systems out in such a way that we're not going to, that story feels outside the norm, but it comes up all the time. Like I said, I'm serving 2,000 folks a year. You can extrapolate that out for the country for how many people encounter these types of issues. The same goes for kind of a more disparate impact upon women in the system every single time, and maybe that's more accessible. Any woman who has changed her name due to marriage and then subsequently potentially for a divorce, those are additional proofs that they've got to pull forward to get their ID and additional costs that they have to take on for every additional document. So if you need to go back and get a certified marriage certificate to show your name as it was, and then go get a copy of the divorce decree to prove that you were divorced and that you want to change the name, that's 3 more documents. It can take up to 3 more weeks, 4 more weeks. Sometimes you're paying per page on the court documents in addition to just the finder's fee, and it rests heavily upon those groups. And we see this, we see it every single week. So when I think about how are we going to help our systems anticipate some of this, it's just that we got to really expand what we think is the typical user experience, is how I've described it before, because how it's designed right now is not typical for the guests that I work with every week. So anywhere that there's family systems where it becomes a challenge to access documents, and I'm usually working with people on their worst day of their life. families end up controlling a child's documents for all kinds of reasons. We see it a lot with LGBTQ youth who have been estranged from their family and they can't go back to their parents, ask for the birth certificate. We see it for women caught in domestic violence situations where a partner has kind of taken over things as a matter of controlling, and you've had to exit that situation for your safety, can't go back in to get the documents you need to then build back up. So we end up starting from zero a lot, and the system is not always considering that as you're trying to answer those things that are there to authenticate your identity, but it's a real barrier and a roadblock.
Did you have a comment, Burdell?
Sorry to interject, but the spirit just moved me when listening to my colleagues on the panel. The most interesting thing that us as a community, a broader community, have to continue to keep top of mind. Normally, the individuals who encounter these challenges, they also do too in a way where they feel ashamed, right? You're ashamed that someone took your identity. You're ashamed that you're estranged due to your sexual orientation. You're ashamed that one would think you chose for someone to you chose to be a part of domestic disputes and domestic violence. And it's at the time where you're at your lowest, as Reverend Ben mentioned, that you really need this assistance and really need help. And as we look at these questionable systems, questionable processes, but large amount of opportunity that we have before us, I think it's also important that we keep that top of mind. The people that we're looking to help are people that are under duress, immense duress, and they don't have a lot of time to try to turn the dial to take positive steps to find funding, to find housing, to basically find information.
That really, the part of what you guys are talking about, and this really dovetails into the next question. We may have kind of answered it already, but the discussion around where to draw the line between security and the frictionless user experience that's a long-standing question or discussion, but we don't often talk about that security versus accessibility conundrum, and both of you really touched on it. I can say from my own personal experience as a woman who got married and changed her name, and I have a fair amount of resources and understanding about how these systems work, and it took me forever. I had one particular account that took me several years to actually transition to my married name. And when I think about folks that don't have some of those key pieces, the access to the foundational identity documents, or they are trying to not let an abuser know where they are or contact them or trace them. To me, these conversations, it's that whole diversity by design, keeping in mind up front that your end user is varied, and not just who they are, but the family structure, the community that they're coming from. These are varied, and we need to have solutions that I don't want to say cater to, but that allow for them to be able to participate. So did you guys have any other, and I'll throw this out to all three of you, just any other things that you want the folks in the audience to consider when it comes to the authentication, verification, or even use, just the use of one's identity and accessibility?
I can start.
Sure.
One of the things that I'd really like people to consider is, looking at this from the other side. It's really important for us to design and architect digital systems that are inclusive of everybody. And that means that we need to include everybody in their architecture and design. I, believe it or not, have had people in the software development community accuse me of faking my blindness, or they're very highly educated people that have a great deal of difficulty understanding that I am also a very highly educated person who does software development. So we need to we need to make sure that we're including people on all sides of this issue. You know, people, and they can't just be people that are like me. I'm coming from a place of quite a bit of privilege. You know, I happen to be white. I happen to be middle-aged and middle class, and come from a middle class upbringing. You know, all of these things, but we need to include people like me, but also people like the people that Pastor Ben are serving, that are coming at this from much different perspectives than even I can come at it from. And you know, I hope we're able to find ways to find those people and bring those people into this conversation, not just as case studies that Burdell or Pastor Ben can talk about, but you know, being able to share our lived experience and say, this is going to work for me, this might not work for me, and also be able to come up with ideas for what might work in its place. I think that is going to be key to anything we do in this space, and that's something that should be familiar to anyone that has been involved in any kind of user experience discipline. So it shouldn't be new, but it's something that we need to put more time and effort into than we are now.
Any other comments, Pastor Ben, Burdell, before we move on to the next question?
Happy to go real quick.
Sure.
One, everything that Chris just said, absolutely. You've got to get the experiences in from the beginning. And so rather than just repeat what he said, I'll just say, you can come access my ministry any week that you want. If you want to observe in real time how it is people are interacting with those types of identity systems, you're welcome to come by here in DC if you're here and see it on any Friday morning that you want. And I think you just have got to, exactly as Chris said, and probably what Burdell's going to say too, get people's experience in up front so you can build the system around it with this and try and anticipate the types of things that people are bringing to the table.
Knowledge is power.
I love it. I love it. I knew you guys were going to have so many thoughtful things to tell us and to inform us. Now let's move on to the challenges. We all seem to be in agreement that this is important, that the diversity by design, starting at the beginning, is really important. But what do you, in your opinion, what do you think will be the biggest challenges for decision makers, leaders, lawmakers to adopt and implement this, this concept of diversity by design and inclusion by default, or any initiatives around that? I can let you guys raise your hand, or I'll pick one of you. Chris, you want to start with that?
Sure. There's this tremendous tension between wanting to protect, I guess it's tension in three ways. Wanting to protect the individual from a government's perspective, or maybe a business's perspective. It's wanting to protect themselves, the business or government entity, from fraud. And then wanting to make sure that everybody is able to access the resources that the government or business entity is trying to offer. And trying to strike that balance is incredibly important. I've personally been involved in efforts where we've gone way too far towards, or we started out from a position of going way too far towards protecting the business and providing a poor experience for the individual. And even the individuals might be current customers of that business. On the other hand, we heard earlier from James Lee that identity crimes and fraud are a big issue, and it's a growing issue. It's not a whatever the opposite of growing. It's not a waning issue. So, you know, we have to do something. We have to do something to protect all sides of these transactions. But when we're doing that, we also need to keep in mind that the something that we do cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution. There need to be lots of different options, lots of different ways to access identity proving services, so that if somebody isn't technologically savvy, they can access an in-person service or a telephone or a video verification service. We also need to have really good online systems, because for somebody like me who is a technical person and has transportation concerns, I'd much rather do something online, especially if it works great and if it's streamlined, than do something in person. But I can tell you that I've worked with seniors or people that are dealing with multiple disabilities who aren't able to use those things the way that I can, and that doesn't make them less of a person. That their need for the things that we all need is equally valid, and whatever policies we put in place, we need to make sure that everybody's included in those policies.
Ben, Burdell, do you guys have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll quickly say, and I agree with everything that he mentioned. But as I think about it, I think it really takes two or three things. One being awareness, right? Typically, people are not aware, and a lot of times our leaders are not aware until it happens to them, or the problem is put right before them, right? And then now there is an urgency or level and intensity around it, where it's, what do I do? What can I do to help? What can I do to get out of this? And I think that takes me to step two. It's around education, right? And this goes into whether it be digital education. We're most definitely living in the middle of a very social environment. When you look at all the different social platforms out there, it's funny, as we were talking today, I was thinking about all the credit bureau agencies that you can go to get your credit score and get identifiers of what's taking place from a financial well-being. 5-10 years ago, that wasn't there. So when we look at some of these fraud challenges and scam artists and different things, identity theft, how can we create more awareness and more education around it? And which takes me to the last piece that was just mentioned by Chris, is more inclusion, or what I would call people being transparent, right? That this is important. We're not going to stand for it, and we're going to put some things in place to try to do away with it. Would be my take.
I would just add, as system builders, policymakers are thinking about things, is to continually ask the question, like, is this absolutely necessary? Because we kind of build out some of these security apparatus and we keep things around that maybe aren't completely necessary. So from where I am, the less I have to do to get somebody their basic document, the better. So if you happen to see something that is not absolutely necessary for someone to have to go through, like, get rid of it, please. And then if you are there and you're actually pulling in folks at the beginning and you're thinking about the different experiences, part of that diversity of experience is income. And so I think a challenge, especially in sort of the climate that we've got, is this sort of fee for service from government agencies. And the longer I'm doing this and I look at fee for service from a government agency on a document that the public is requiring you to have to participate in the community, I'm like, it doesn't look like we fully funded this government agency, and they're having to operate by pulling in fees from people while giving them back a document we're requiring them to have, which means, come and play, but pay me for the privilege. That doesn't work for folks when I don't want I don't want their income going in that direction. I want their income going into something for their family, something entrepreneurial, something to support their community in a wider way, not just to get step one done so they can then try and re-enter the community. So I'm like, but that's a huge challenge. I don't see us fully funding agencies like immigration, customs, and service, where, as I was mentioning in some of our written correspondence, if you need to replace a green card in order to prove that you're here legally in order to get another document, that's a close to $500 charge right away just to get one document to then get the next. And that's a lot. That's a lot for any of us.
Well, and you know what you bring up, I'm going to jump to the last question because we're coming up on time. So really just some of your last thoughts about the myths around accessing or using the either technology, some of these systems by the different populations that you guys work with, because I think there are plenty of them out there, and that might just give some insight for people. I'll go ahead, Ben, let's start with you again.
Would you mind just saying that one more time?
Just in my mind, when I think about, there's some myths around accessibility, barriers to accessibility, and how different populations either use technology or use our identity verification services. And I'll say this in a very inartful way, but there may be a lot of folks that think, why would a homeless person need their birth certificate? Why would a homeless person need to authenticate themselves online? I think that's a myth. Are there any other myths out there that you'd like to dispel about the need and use of these different the technologies and authentication and verification?
Sure. And I'll take your hypothetical and then I'll keep going. The reason that my folks have to access the birth certificate, the social security card, you've got to build all of those documents together before you can go and ask for your non-driver's ID from the DMV. You got to get all that stuff in order first because of the Real ID Act. So now my folks lose their documents because of here in DC, the tent encampment clearances. People, like the city, will come and like throw away your items off of the street. Sometimes your vital documents are in there. Your stuff will get rained on, snowed on, stolen if you happen to be sleeping out, sometimes in the shelters as well. So our folks lose documents for all kinds of reasons. Evictions is another one. So as they're building back, I work with a lot of, when we talk about the system and how it's a bit inaccessible, I work with a lot of people with substance abuse challenges. I work with a lot of people with some mental health issues or intellectual disabilities. And when you get into a software system, like a knowledge-based quiz on the VitalCheck KBA, you're getting questions that are like kind of negative questions. Which one of these addresses have you never been associated with? And my people did a good job just to get in the door to see me, to then be met with questions that are kind of intentionally confusing. And then you're failing that. And let's say you did manage to pass the KBA in the first place, you've still got another 4 or 5 steps ahead of you after you leave the church to try and make it to Social Security office, Vital Statistic office, Department of Motor Vehicles on a time frame that is now 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks for each of those things to happen. That's a ton. That is a Herculean effort just to get your document done. That's a massive barrier of participation, because again, the goal here, and I think the thing we all want to see, is you are housed, you are working and supporting yourself or your family, and you have got your kids in the schools where they need to be. But when we build our systems in such a way that we're not giving a lot of attention to how challenging it can be for what are sometimes considered subsets of the population, we're locking folks out, and we're locking folks out for sometimes years on end.
Well, gentlemen, we are actually at time, but I do want to give Chris and Burdell 30 seconds for your final thoughts.
So My final thought is everything Pastor Ben just said is equally applicable to people with disabilities, many of whom are making $849 a month on Social Security benefits if they can get them because they have the right ID to qualify for that. Many of those people don't want to be receiving benefits. They want to get off of those and find jobs, and you need to have all of this identity documentation in order to get a job. And it's hard enough for someone with a disability to get a job offer in the first place. Let's make it easy for them to accept it.
Thanks, Chris. Burdell, 30 seconds, final thoughts, and then I'll hand it back to Jeremy.
I'll try to be faster than that, Eva. I think the one word I would like to leave everyone with is compassion. Compassion for your neighbors, compassion for others, everyone who finds themselves in a scenario that we've talked about today. And we've provided several examples. It's not always their fault. And in my experience, typically 99.9% of them do not want to be in the position that they're in. And that's when the one word again comes top of mind: compassion. Please have compassion as you walk through the changes that you can potentially make, how we interact and deal with others, but also the thought leadership that's needed around our future.
I think that's a great note to end on. Compassion. And Jeremy, with that, I will hand it back to you.
Thanks. Really appreciate it. Chris, Pastor Ben, Burdell, Eva, thank you so much for taking the time to speak. I had, for those who aren't looking in the chat, I had also posted a link to Founder United Methodist Church, if anybody's interested in supporting the work that Pastor Ben and his team does. But beyond financial contributions, I'd also urge you to get in touch with him and look to volunteer. I've spent some time there. As somebody who's come at this from the security perspective early in my career, it really changed how I think about identity systems, and helped to get me thinking about some of the topics we've been talking about today. The other point I'll just flag is, to me personally, one of the questions that also got me asking as I see the work that they're doing, which is incredibly inspirational, is as a fellow resident of Washington, D.C., why do I have to depend on a bunch of volunteers at a church to get this assistance? Why is this not something that the city itself is able to help in? And I think as we've started to explore this topic a little bit in the Better Identity Coalition, we've learned there aren't many jurisdictions that actually offer people help. One of the things that's emerged from this, we heard Tim Weiler talk before about Congressman Foster's bill, which is a bipartisan bill, the Improving Digital Identity Act. Congressman Foster and Langevin and the Democratic side teamed up with Congressman Katko and Loudermilk Republicans. But there's an element of that if grants were to go forward to states to invest in digital identity systems, 10% of it will be put aside to help people who are in a situation where they can't easily get an ID. And so not that we've gotten that bill passed into law yet, but I've been happy we've actually been able to get bipartisan support on the Hill for what to me seems like it should be a very nonpartisan, common sense, provision, but clearly something that has not been getting attention from governments across the country. So I really thank all of you for coming to talk today about things.